We all know that your property is yours, right? Like, that's a basic principle. But things get messy when someone tries to challenge that? So today we're digging into a case from the Pakistan Supreme Court, and it all revolves around the Illegal Dispossession Act of 2005.
It's a fascinating case because it really shows how these property disputes can happen even within families, and it underscores the vital role of the law in these situations.
Absolutely. So let's lay out the situation here. It involves two brothers, right, fighting over their deceased brother's house. One brother, the respondent in this case, his name's Ijaz Ahmed, he was actually legally gifted the property back in 2008, so everything's above board. Then their brother passes away in 2015, and a few years later, in 2020, the other brother, we'll call him Niaz Ahmed, he's the petitioner in this case, he and his wife, well, they decide to move into a part of the house. The problem is, they didn't have Ijaz's permission at all. In fact, he was away, and they actually went so far as to break the locks to get in. And to make matters worse, when Ijaz tried to get the police involved, nothing happened.
Yeah, that inaction from law enforcement is a perfect example of why the Illegal Dispossession Act exists in the first place. It provides a legal remedy when the normal channels for addressing these kinds of situations fail. And this is a clear case of unlawful occupation.
It really is. So Ijaz, he decides to file a complaint under the IDA, this 2005 law, and he actually got a possession order from the additional sessions judge, which basically told Niaz and his wife, hey, you got to get out. But of course, the story doesn't end there, right?
Right. Niaz decided to appeal that order, challenging it first in the High Court. And the High Court actually sided with the sessions judge. So then it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And is appealed by Niaz, the brother who was told to vacate. Well, it brings up some really important questions about how this law is supposed to be applied in real-life situations. It puts it to the test.
And that's exactly what we're focusing on today. We're diving into the Supreme Court's reasoning for upholding the IDA in this very specific, kind of unique situation with a family dispute at the heart of it. What does this ruling tell us about property rights in Pakistan? How about the rule of law? And what happens when someone takes the law into their own hands, especially when it involves family? There's a lot to unpack here. So let's start with one of the main arguments that Niaz, the brother who moved into the house, put forward. He claimed that the IDA, this 2005 law, it was only intended to go after what they call the Qabza Mafia, or land grabbers. What did the Supreme Court say about that?
Well, this is where the Supreme Court really drew a clear line in the sand. They basically said, no, that's a misinterpretation of the law. They completely rejected this argument, saying it was misconceived and contradicted existing legal principles. They were very clear that the Illegal Dispossession Act is meant to protect any legitimate owner of property from being illegally kicked out, regardless of who's doing the dispossessing. It doesn't matter if it's some organized group or a family member, the law applies equally.
So the focus is on the act itself, the illegal dispossession, not on who's carrying it out.
Exactly. It's about the act, not the actor. And to emphasize this point, they actually reference the very definition of occupier and owner as laid out in Section 2 of the IDA 2005. An occupier is someone with lawful possession, meaning they're there legally, and an owner, well, that's the person who actually owns the property when the dispossession happens. The key here is that the ownership can't have been attained through some illegal means.
Okay, so that makes sense. The law is about the wrongful act itself, not about labeling specific types of people as the only ones it applies to. Now, the court didn't stop there, right? They brought in some previous rulings to back up their interpretation.
That's right. They cited a couple of precedents that are really important here. The first one is Mumtaz Hussain v. Dr. Nasir Khan and others from 2010. That case already established that Section 3 of the IDA has a broad scope and that it covers dispossession by anyone. They specifically mentioned property grabbers, those Qabza groups and land mafia that Niaz was trying to limit it to, but the court said no. It applies much more broadly than that.
Right, so that precedent really established a clear understanding that this law isn't narrowly focused. But there was a second case they mentioned too, right?
Yes. The second case is Miss Gulshan Bibi and others v. Muhammad Sadiq and others. This was from 2016, and it's interesting because the court went even further. They said straight out that it doesn't matter what class the offender belongs to. The most important factor is whether the person entered the property without any legal right to do so. And of course, they have to have the intent to take it over to dispossess the owner, whether it's by force or any other means. And this part is really relevant to the case we're discussing because it directly addresses the question of whether family members are somehow exempt from this law. The Supreme Court's stance is no, family ties don't give you a free pass to break the law. If you illegally dispossess someone, even if they're family, you're still subject to the consequences.
I see. So the law really prioritizes the legality of the action itself over personal relationships. It's about fairness and upholding property rights regardless of who's involved. So, moving on, Niaz also tried to argue that because there was already a civil dispute going on related to this property, the IDA shouldn't apply. What did the Supreme Court have to say about that?
This is another important point. The Supreme Court basically said, nope, that argument doesn't hold water either. They made it crystal clear that just because there's a civil case going on, that doesn't mean the Illegal Dispossession Act can't be applied. They referenced their own ruling in a case from 2016 called Sheikh Mohammed Nassim v. Emens Farida Gul. That case clearly established that civil liability, what you're responsible for in a civil case, and criminal penalties, those are two separate things. They can exist independently of each other.
So, in simple terms, even if you're fighting over who legally owns something in a civil court, that doesn't give you the right to just barge in and take possession.
You got it. It's like the Supreme Court is saying, look, you can't just take the law into your own hands. You can't just kick someone out illegally and then say, oh, but we have a civil case pending. The law doesn't work that way. These are parallel legal processes that address different aspects of the situation. One is about determining who actually has the legal right to the property, and the other is about the illegal act of taking possession, regardless of who ultimately ends up being the rightful owner.
That's a really important distinction for people to understand. So let's move on to something else that came up in this case. The IDA also includes this provision for what they call interim relief under Section 7. Can you explain a little about what that section is about and what conditions the Supreme Court highlighted for using it?
Sure. Section 7 of the IDA is designed to give some quick, temporary relief to the person who's been unlawfully dispossessed while the main trial is still in progress. It basically allows the court to issue an order saying, okay, give the property back to the original owner for now. But the Supreme Court outlined three very important conditions that have to be met before a court can use Section 7(1).
Let's break those down. What's the first condition?
The first condition is pretty straightforward. This relief, this temporary return of possession, can only be granted during trial. And they were very specific about what trial means in this context. They cited a case from 2000, Hakawaz and others v. the state, and others, to clarify this, it doesn't mean right when the court first gets the case. The trial officially begins when the charges against the accused person are formally presented. In this particular case, the charge had already been framed, and the court was in the middle of taking evidence, so that condition was met.
So during trial means that the case is already in a pretty advanced stage, not just starting out. All right, what's the second condition for this interim relief?
For the second condition, the court has to be satisfied that the person in possession of the property is prima facie, not lawfully there. Prima facie basically means at first glance, or based on the initial evidence. It doesn't require absolute proof of guilt, just a strong indication that something illegal has happened. In this case, the trial court had already decided that there was a strong prima facie case that Ijez, the brother who was gifted the house, was in the right, and Niaz couldn't really justify why he was occupying the property.
Got it.
The last condition is that if the court decides those first two conditions have been met, then they have no choice but to order the property to be returned to the rightful owner, at least temporarily. It's not up to their discretion. The Act uses the word shall, meaning they are obligated to do it. It's a mandatory step if those conditions are met.
Makes sense. It's a way to protect the person who's been wrongly dispossessed while the full legal process plays out. Now, there's one more thing we should discuss. Niaz also tried to use Section 265K of the Criminal Procedure Code to his advantage. Can you tell us what that section is all about and why the Supreme Court wasn't having it?
Okay, so Section 265K of the CRPC basically gives the trial court the power to say, all right, we're acquitting the accused person. They can do this at any point during the case if they believe there's no probability of that person being found guilty. This power is there even before formal charges are laid out or before all the evidence is presented, but it does require that both sides get a chance to be heard. It's like a safety valve in the system. It's for situations where it becomes clear that the case is going nowhere.
So it's a mechanism to avoid wasting everyone's time and resources if the outcome seems pretty obvious.
Exactly. But the Supreme Court made it clear that this power shouldn't be used lightly. They emphasized that while it's there to prevent unnecessary trials, it's only for extraordinary circumstances. They cited a case, the State v. Raja Abdul Rahman from 2005, to reinforce this point. Generally speaking, they said, criminal cases should be decided on their merits after all the evidence and arguments have been presented. This early acquittal is really for special situations.
I'm curious, what kind of situations would qualify as extraordinary circumstances where it's highly unlikely the person will be convicted?
The Supreme Court gave some examples. Let's say the facts of the case, even if they're true, don't actually amount to a crime under the law. Or maybe there's absolutely no evidence to back up the charges. Or the evidence that does exist is clearly not strong enough to lead to a conviction. Or maybe it seems highly unlikely that any new evidence will change things. Those are the kinds of scenarios where this provision might come into play.
Okay, I see. So why didn't Nias's arguments fit into any of those categories?
Because what he was arguing, that the IDA doesn't apply to family, and that the pending civil case somehow invalidates the criminal proceedings, those arguments went against what the Supreme Court had already clearly established in previous rulings. They were contradicting well-settled legal principles. So his attempt to use Section 265-K was a no-go. The trial court and the high court were right to deny his request for early acquittal.
So after considering everything, all these arguments and legal back and forth, what was the Supreme Court's final decision?
In the end, the Supreme Court decided that the high court's judgment was sound. They said it was well-reasoned, and they basically said that Nias hadn't given them any good reason to step in and overturn it. So they dismissed his appeals and said, no, you don't get to appeal this further. This basically upholds the high court's decision. They did say that their observations were tentative, meaning they weren't making a final judgment on the case itself. The trial court still has to make its own decision on the main complaint under the IDA, based on all the evidence presented during the trial. The Supreme Court's comments don't dictate the final outcome.
Okay, so to wrap things up for our listeners, can you give us the key takeaways from our deep dive into the Supreme Court judgment?
Absolutely. The main takeaways are these. First, the Illegal Dispossession Act of 2005 has a broad scope. It covers anyone who unlawfully dispossesses a legal owner or someone with lawful possession, even if they're family members. Second, having a civil case going on doesn't stop criminal proceedings under this law. They operate independently. Third, the court can grant interim relief, meaning they can order the property to be returned temporarily while the trial is happening, but only if certain conditions are met. And finally, getting acquitted early under that Section 265-K, that's a rare thing. It's reserved for cases where there's a very clear lack of probability of conviction based on the law and the evidence. And it can't be used to go against established legal principles.
This judgment really sends a strong message about the importance of property rights and the rule of law in Pakistan. It shows that taking the law into your own hands has consequences, no matter who you are or what other legal matters might be going on. It leaves us with a lot to think about, doesn't it? What are the broader implications for society when we have laws like the Illegal Dispossession Act? How do they help to maintain order and prevent people from just resorting to self-help when they have a property dispute? These are important questions to consider.
I think that's a great point to end on. It definitely gives us all something to think about.
It does. All right, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.